What she was about to discover in an attic that hadn't been opened since 1953 would rewrite everything historians thought they knew about the Vietnam War. Before we dive into this incredible story, tell us where you're watching from, and if this resonates with you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow's story will blow your mind even more. But let's start from the beginning before we jump back in. Tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The rolling hills of Millbrook Valley stretched endlessly under the Pennsylvania sky, their gentle slopes dotted with century-old oak trees and weathered stone walls that spoke of generations who had worked this land. The small farming community of just over 1,200 residents had maintained its quiet rhythm for decades, where everyone knew their neighbors and change came slowly, but all. Jessica Martinez had never expected to own property here or anywhere, for that matter. At 32, she was drowning in medical bills from her 8-year-old daughter Emma's ongoing treatment for juvenile diabetes, working double shifts as a night nurse at Pittsburgh General Hospital while trying to maintain some semblance of stability. For her bright, resilient child, a divorce 2 years earlier had left them financially devastated. And Jessica had been seriously considering bankruptcy when the letter arrived. Great-Aunt Eleanor passed away last month, the lawyer's formal correspondence had stated. As her only surviving relative, you have inherited the Whitmore Farmhouse and its 47 acres in Millbrook Valley, Pennsylvania. Jessica had stared at the letter for a full 5 minutes, reading and rereading the words as if they might change or disappear. She had only met Eleanor Whitmore once, at a family reunion when she was 12, and again at her grandmother's funeral 5 years ago. Eleanor had been a stern, private woman in her 80s who spoke little and seemed to carry secrets in her sharp gray eyes. Jessica remembered her as someone who listened more than she talked, always observing with an intensity that made even adults uncomfortable. The inheritance seemed like a miracle wrapped in complications. The farmhouse came with no mortgage, but also with decades of deferred maintenance, property taxes Jessica couldn't afford, and the daunting prospect of uprooting Emma from the only community she'd ever known. Pittsburgh offered Jessica steady employment and Emma access to the medical specialists who managed her diabetes. Moving to rural Pennsylvania meant leaving behind everything familiar for the unknown, but the mounting bills and the constant stress of city life had taken their toll. Their cramped 2-bedroom apartment on the north side of Pittsburgh felt more like a prison than a home. Thin walls that carried their neighbors' arguments and sirens that punctuated Emma's sleep throughout the night. The medical insurance that Jessica had fought so hard to maintain still left them with co-pays and deductibles that consumed most of her paycheck. Emma's insulin pump, glucose monitoring supplies, and regular endocrinologist visits created a monthly expense that forced impossible choices between medical necessities and basic needs, like groceries and utilities. Emma, despite her medical challenges, had always been drawn to nature and open spaces during their rare weekend trips outside the city. She collected leaves, photographed birds with Jessica's old phone, and dreamed of having a dog, possible in their apartment with its strict no-pets policy and barely enough space for their existing furniture. Maybe we could try it for the summer, Jessica had suggested one evening as they sat at their tiny kitchen table, reviewing Eleanor's inheritance paperwork together. See how it feels, meet the neighbors, figure out what the property is worth. Emma's eyes had lit up with excitement, tempered by practical concern that shouldn't have existed in someone so young. What about my doctors? And your job? Dr. Williams said there are good endocrinologists in Harrisburg, about 40 minutes away, Jessica replied. Having already spent hours researching medical care in the area, I can find nursing work anywhere. The question is whether you want to try something completely different. Can we really have a dog? Emma had asked with the hope that only 8-year-olds can summon for life-changing possibilities. If we can make it work, yes, we can have a dog. The decision had been made with the kind of desperate optimism that comes from having limited options. An unlimited determination. Jessica gave notice at the hospital, arranged for Emma's medical records to be transferred, and used her entire savings account to rent a U-Haul truck for their modest possessions. The $1,847 she had accumulated over 2 years of cutting every possible expense would have to cover the move. first month's utilities, and whatever emergency repairs the farmhouse might require. The 3-hour drive from Pittsburgh to Millbrook Valley took them through Pennsylvania's changing landscape, from urban sprawl to suburban developments to rolling farmland that seemed untouched by time. Emma pressed her face against the passenger window, documenting their journey with phone photos of barns, horses, and fields that stretched to the horizon. "Mom, look at all the space," she said with wonder as they crested a hill and saw the valley spread below them. "There's nobody else around for miles." "That's going to be an adjustment," Jessica replied, feeling her own mixture of excitement and terror. As she contemplated the isolation that would soon become their reality, the Whitmore farmhouse sat at the end of a gravel lane that wound through mature maple trees and overgrown pastures where wildflowers had reclaimed the land. The 2-story wooden structure, painted white with green shutters, showed its age in sagging front steps and weathered siding, but the bones were solid. A wide front porch wrapped around 2 sides of the house, offering views of the valley that stretched toward distant mountains. The property included several outbuildings, a large barn that looked surprisingly well maintained, a smaller structure that might have been a workshop, and what appeared to be the remains of chicken coops from decades past. "It's bigger than our apartment," Emma observed as they pulled into the circular driveway, her voice carrying awe at the sheer scale of space they now apparently owned. "Everything's bigger than our apartment," Jessica replied, parking the U-Haul truck beside a garden area where someone had clearly spent considerable effort on landscaping that was now beginning to return to wildness. The interior revealed decades of careful maintenance, mixed with the outdated decor of someone who had stopped updating her surroundings sometime in the 1970s. Floral wallpaper covered most surfaces. The kitchen appliances were avocado green, and the furniture carried the solid, unfashionable weight of pieces built to last generations. But everything was clean, organized, and functional in ways that suggested Eleanor had maintained her home with the same methodical care she had apparently applied to every aspect of her life. The house felt welcoming in ways their city apartment never had. High ceilings, hardwood floors, and windows that actually opened to let in fresh air created a sense of space and possibility that Jessica hadn't experienced since childhood. The living room featured a stone fireplace surrounded by built-in bookshelves filled with volumes on gardening. Local history was what appeared to be an extensive collection of military histories and biographies. Emma immediately claimed a bedroom on the 2nd floor that overlooked the valley, its windows providing a panoramic view of rolling hills and distant forests. The room was decorated with the kind of careful neutrality that suggested Eleanor had hoped someday to have children in her home, even though that dream had never materialized. Jessica chose Eleanor's former room, which featured a sitting area, with comfortable chairs positioned to catch the morning sun and French doors that opened onto the wraparound porch. The closet still contained some of Eleanor's clothing, practical dresses, sturdy shoes, and a few pieces that suggested she had once dressed for special occasions that no longer came. Their first week in Millbrook Valley provided a crash course in rural living and small-town social dynamics. The nearest grocery store was 15 minutes away in the village center, housed in a building that had clearly served the community for generations. Miller's General Store carried everything from groceries to hardware supplies to livestock feed, operating with the kind of efficiency that only comes from decades of serving the same customers with similar needs. Martha Henderson, the store's owner, whose family had run the business for 3 generations, greeted Jessica's appearance as Eleanor's mysterious heir with polite curiosity and careful observation from longtime residents who had learned to be cautious about outsiders. Eleanor kept to herself mostly, Martha explained as she rang up Jessica's groceries, her tone carrying the neutral friendliness that small communities use to gather information about newcomers. Nice enough woman, but private. Didn't socialize much after her husband died in Vietnam. "I didn't know she'd been married," Jessica replied, realizing how little she knew about the woman whose house she'd inherited and whose carefully preserved life she was now somehow responsible for continuing. "Oh yes, married young to Robert Whitmore just before he shipped out in 1968. Beautiful wedding, what I'm told. I was just a child then, but my mother always talked about it. He was killed in action about 6 months later." Eleanor never remarried, just stayed on that farm by herself for over 50 years. The information painted Eleanor's solitary life in a more poignant light. Jessica began to understand why her great-aunt had seemed so reserved during their brief encounter. She'd spent most of her adult life alone, shaped by a loss that had occurred when she was barely older than Jessica was now. 50 years, Jessica repeated, trying to imagine the kind of determination required to maintain a property and a life through that much solitude. She was devoted to Robert's memory, Martha continued, her voice carrying the respect that small communities reserve for those who demonstrate unwavering loyalty. Every Memorial Day, she'd place flowers on his memorial at the cemetery, never missed a year, even when her arthritis got bad and walking was difficult. The practical challenges of rural living quickly became apparent as Jessica and Emma settled into their new routine. The well water had a sulfur smell that required a filtration system Jessica couldn't afford. The electrical wiring was old enough to make appliances flicker unexpectedly, particularly when the refrigerator cycled on. The heating system relied on an oil furnace that would require expensive fuel delivery before winter, an expense that Jessica tried not to calculate too precisely. The internet connection was spotty at best, making it difficult for Jessica to research employment opportunities or for Emma to maintain contact with friends in Pittsburgh. Cell phone coverage required positioning yourself near specific windows, and the landline telephone in Eleanor's kitchen operated with the kind of rotary dial that Emma had only seen in movies, but Emma thrived in ways that surprised them both. Her blood sugar levels stabilized with the reduced stress and increased physical activity of exploring their property. The constant worry about neighborhood safety that had characterized their Pittsburgh life simply didn't exist here. Emma could walk outside without Jessica's supervision, explore the barn and outbuildings, and spend hours watching birds and wildlife that had been completely absent from their urban environment. She helped Jessica plant a small vegetable garden in the area where Eleanor had apparently maintained flowers, learning to distinguish between weeds and the perennial plants that returned each spring. She discovered a collection of field guides in Eleanor's bookshelves and began teaching herself to identify birds, trees, and wildflowers that surrounded their property. Most importantly, she made friends with the Henderson family's golden retriever during trips to the grocery store, demonstrating the kind of natural comfort with animals that Jessica had never had the opportunity to nurture in their previous living situation. Mrs. Henderson said there might be a puppy available from their neighbor's dog in a few weeks, Emma reported after one such visit. Her attempt to advance their dog acquisition plans only slightly more subtle than her usual direct approach. She said to ask you about it, and that they'd make sure we got one that's good with kids. Jessica smiled at her daughter's transparent campaign. Let's get through our first month here before we add a puppy to the situation. We still have a lot to figure out about taking care of ourselves. The breakthrough in their exploration of Eleanor's house came during their second week, when a thunderstorm knocked out power and left them searching for candles and flashlights in unfamiliar cabinets and closets. Emma discovered a box of emergency supplies in the upstairs linen closet, along with a handwritten note in Eleanor's careful script that mentioned important papers in the attic trunk for whoever comes after me. Mom, I think Great Aunt Eleanor left us a message, Emma announced, showing Jessica the note written on stationery that bore Eleanor's name and address. What kind of message? Jessica asked, examining the careful handwriting that indicated Eleanor had deliberately left instructions for whoever might eventually inherit her home. The note was brief, but specific. Important family documents and Robert's military records are preserved in the attic trunk. These papers should be reviewed by someone who will understand their historical significance. Contact Dr. Sarah Mitchell at Penn State if questions arise about their importance. Jessica considered the possibility that Eleanor had left documentation about property boundaries, mineral rights, or other issues that new property owners should understand. Rural properties often came with complications that weren't immediately obvious. Eleanor's methodical nature suggested she would have wanted to provide guidance for her successor. Maybe there's information about the land or legal stuff about the house, Jessica mused, though the mention of military records and historical significance suggested something more complex than simple property documentation. Can we look now? Emma asked with the curiosity that had characterized her approach to their new environment. Jessica examined the pull-down attic access in the hallway ceiling. Noting the sturdy construction and the fact that Eleanor had apparently used this storage space regularly enough to maintain it properly. Right, she decided. Let's see what Great Aunt Eleanor wanted us to find. The attic access ladder creaked slightly, but held Jessica's weight as she climbed into the space beneath the farmhouse's sloped roof. The area was larger than expected, with enough headroom for comfortable movement and windows at each end that provided natural light during daytime hours. Unlike the cluttered storage spaces she had anticipated, Eleanor's attic was organized with the same careful precision that characterized the rest of her home. Boxes were labeled with contents and dates. Seasonal decorations were stored in clearly marked containers, and household items were arranged with the kind of systematic efficiency that made everything easy to locate. The space felt more like a well-organized archive than a typical attic storage area. "There's a trunk over here," Jessica called down to Emma, who was waiting at the bottom of the ladder with a flashlight and eager questions about what was visible from above. The trunk was an old military footlocker, olive green with brass hardware, and painted stenciling that read, "L.T.R. Whitmore, 1st Infantry Division." Eleanor's husband's military trunk, preserved in the attic for over 50 years, with the same careful attention Eleanor had applied to maintaining everything else in her home. Jessica felt a moment of hesitation about opening what was clearly a memorial to Eleanor's lost husband. These were personal belongings, private memories, intimate artifacts of a relationship that had been cut tragically short. But the note had specifically mentioned important papers and military records, and Eleanor had deliberately left instructions for her heir to review these materials. The trunk's hinges moved smoothly, indicating that Eleanor had accessed its contents periodically over the decades. The interior was organized with the same methodical precision that characterized everything else Eleanor had maintained. Military uniforms, perfectly preserved and wrapped in tissue paper, occupied one section. Official documentation of Lieutenant Robert Whitmore's service record filled another area, including commendation letters, service medals, and correspondence from military superiors that painted a picture of a young officer who had earned respect and recognition during his brief time in Vietnam. Wedding photographs of Eleanor and Robert were both impossibly young and radiating the kind of happiness that made their story's ending even more tragic, were carefully preserved in protective albums. Eleanor had been beautiful in the way that photographs from the 1960s captured, elegant, hopeful, dressed in white lace with flowers in her hair. Robert had looked proud and serious in his dress uniform, every inch the committed soldier about to serve his country. But beneath the personal memorabilia, Jessica found something that didn't belong in a simple collection of military remembrances. Leather-bound journal, wrapped in oilcloth and secured with string, bore Robert Whitmore's name and the dates. January 1968, March 1968, written in careful script on the cover. The journal was accompanied by detailed maps, sketches, and what appeared to be official military documents that had been copied by hand rather than officially issued. Inside the front cover, a note in different handwriting, Lenores explained. The journal's significance. Robert wrote in this journal during his final months in Vietnam. He mailed it to me just before he was killed, with specific instructions that it should only be opened if something happened to him. I've kept it sealed for 55 years, but I believe these records are too important to remain hidden forever. You're reading this, I'm gone, and it's time for the truth to be told. Contact Dr. Sarah Mitchell, Military History Department, Penn State University. Tell her Eleanor sent you, and that it's time for the Whitmore records to be examined by someone who will understand their significance. These documents contain information that could change how people understand what really happened in Vietnam. Robert died trying to protect information that his superiors wanted to bury. Don't let his sacrifice be for nothing. Eleanor Whitmore, 2023. Jessica's hands trembled as she opened the journal, reading entries that chronicled Lieutenant Robert Whitmore's experience with military operations that had never appeared in any official history of the Vietnam War. The writing was methodical, detailed, and increasingly concerned as Robert documented activities that clearly violated official military policy and international law. The journal described reconnaissance missions that didn't exist in official records, unauthorized incursions into Cambodia and Laos that preceded publicly acknowledged military actions by months, and interactions with local populations that contradicted every official narrative about American military conduct in Southeast Asia. Robert had documented names, dates, coordinates, and detailed accounts of orders that had apparently come from command, levels far above his official superiors. More troubling were his descriptions of efforts to suppress information about civilian casualties, environmental damage from chemical weapons, and military strategies that prioritized political objectives over soldier safety. Robert had clearly understood that he was witnessing and participating in activities that would never be acknowledged by official military historians. The final entries, written just days before Robert's death, described his decision to document everything he had observed and mail the records to Eleanor for safekeeping. He had apparently recognized that his superiors were becoming suspicious of his attention to details they preferred to keep unrecorded. If something happens to me, these records need to be preserved. What we're doing here isn't what people back home think we're doing. Someone needs to know the truth about American operations in Southeast Asia. I'm sending this to Eleanor because I trust her to understand its importance and to find the right people to review these documents when the time is right. I love you. Eleanor, take care of yourself and don't let them bury what really happened here. Robert Jessica sat in Eleanor's attic, reading her late husband's careful documentation of events that had shaped American foreign policy for decades, and realized that her inheritance included far more than a farmhouse and land. She had inherited evidence of military operations that had been classified for over 50 years, documented by someone who had been there, witnessed events that had never been officially acknowledged, and recorded details that could fundamentally change historical understanding of American involvement in Vietnam. The implications were staggering. If Robert's documentation was accurate and the detailed maps, coordinates, and official document numbers suggested extensive verification, then much of what Americans believed about the Vietnam War was incomplete or deliberately misleading. The journal contained evidence of war crimes, unauthorized military actions, and systematic cover-ups that reached the highest levels of military command. As Jessica climbed down from the attic, carrying Robert's journal and Eleanor's instructions to contact Dr. Mitchell, she realized that her simple inheritance had evolved into something far more complex and potentially dangerous. She was now the custodian of military secrets that powerful people had worked for decades to keep hidden. Emma looked up from the book. She had been reading while waiting for Jessica's exploration to conclude. Did you find anything interesting? Considered how to explain to her 8-year-old daughter that they had just inherited evidence that could rewrite American military history and potentially expose war crimes that had been covered up for over 50 years. I found something very important, Jessica said carefully. Something that might change how people understand history. Like what kind of history? The kind that Great Aunt Eleanor kept safe for a very long time, waiting for the right person to find it and decide what to do with it. Jessica looked around the farmhouse that Eleanor had maintained with such careful precision, understanding now that every detail had been preserved, not just as a home, but as a repository for secrets that Eleanor had been protecting until someone she trusted could take responsibility for them. The journal in her hands contained information that governments had classified for decades. It's documented by a soldier who had died trying to preserve the truth about American military operations that had never been officially acknowledged. Eleanor had spent 55 years protecting her husband's final gift to history, waiting for someone who would have the courage and integrity to ensure that his sacrifice hadn't been for nothing. As the evening fell over, Millbrook Valley and Emma helped Jessica prepare dinner in Eleanor's kitchen. Jessica realized that their simple plan for a fresh start in rural Pennsylvania evolved into something far more significant and potentially perilous. They weren't just inheriting a farmhouse. They were inheriting a responsibility to ensure that historical truth prevailed over political convenience. Regardless of the personal cost, the journal hidden in Eleanor's attic for over 50 years was about to emerge into a world that might not be ready for the truths it contained. And Jessica Martinez, a single mother who had moved to Pennsylvania seeking only stability and a better life for her daughter, was about to become the guardian of military secrets that could change everything people thought they knew about American involvement in Vietnam. The story was just beginning. Jessica had no idea how much courage she would need for what lay ahead. The morning sun streamed through Eleanor's kitchen windows as Jessica sat at the worn wooden table, Robert's journal open before her and a cup of coffee growing cold in her hands. She had spent most of the night reading and rereading the entries, trying to comprehend the magnitude of what Eleanor had entrusted to her care. Each page revealed more disturbing details about military operations that had been systematically hidden from public knowledge for over 50 years. Emma had already finished her breakfast and was outside exploring the barn, her laughter occasionally drifting through the open windows as she discovered the remnants of Eleanor's long-abandoned attempts at raising chickens. The sound of her daughter's joy provided a stark contrast to the weight of the decisions Jessica now faced. The journal contained more than just Robert's personal observations. Tucked between pages were photocopies of classified documents, hand-drawn, maps marking locations that didn't appear on official military charts, and lists of personnel involved in operations that had never been publicly acknowledged. Robert had clearly understood that his documentation needed to be comprehensive enough to verify his claims, even decades after the events occurred. One entry, dated February 15, 1968, described an unauthorized bombing mission into Cambodia that had resulted in significant civilian casualties. Colonel Morrison ordered strikes on targets that intel said were weapons caches, but when we reached the coordinates, it was clear we were hitting villages. Pilot questioned the orders twice over radio, but Morrison insisted we proceed. Afterwards, body count included at least 40 civilians, including children. Official report filed the mission as successful interdiction of enemy supply lines. With no mention of civilian casualties, Morrison told us the mission never happened and warned against discussing it with anyone. I'm documenting everything because someone needs to know what we're really doing here. Jessica felt sick reading Robert's careful documentation of war crimes that had been covered up by military leadership. The implications extended far beyond historical curiosity if Robert's records were accurate. They provided evidence of systematic violations of international law that could still have legal and political consequences for people who might still be alive. The telephone's ring interrupted her reading, the old rotary phone's harsh sound jarring in the quiet kitchen. Jessica approached it cautiously, wondering who would be calling Eleanor's number just weeks after her death. "Hello?" she answered, uncertain about the proper etiquette for inheriting someone else's phone line. "Is this Jessica Martinez?" The voice was female, professional, with the kind of careful diction that suggested academic background. "Yes. Who's calling?" "This is Dr. Sarah Mitchell from Penn State University's Military History Department. I received your contact information from Eleanor Whitmore's attorney. You said you might be calling about some documents Eleanor wanted me to review." Jessica felt a rush of relief mixed with apprehension. Eleanor had apparently made arrangements. Beyond the note in the journal, ensuring that Dr. Mitchell would be prepared for contact about the Whitmore records. "Dr. Mitchell?" "Yes. I was planning to call you. I found the documents Eleanor mentioned, and I think you need to see them as soon as possible." "Can you give me a general idea of what you've discovered?" Dr. Mitchell asked, her tone becoming more focused. Jessica chose her words carefully. Uncertain about telephone security, but recognizing the need to convey the seriousness of the situation. "Military records from Vietnam. 1968. Very detailed documentation of operations that don't appear in official histories. Eleanor's notes suggested you would understand their significance." There was a pause before Dr. Mitchell responded, and Jessica could hear the sound of papers being moved. "Ms. Martinez, I need you to understand that what you're describing could be extremely sensitive material. Before we proceed, I need to know, have you shown these documents to anyone else?" "No, just my daughter, and she doesn't understand what they mean." "Good. Don't discuss this with anyone else until we've had a chance to evaluate what you've found. I can drive out to Millbrook Valley this afternoon if you're available. We need to assess these materials in a secure environment before determining how to proceed." "You know about this stuff already, don't you?" Jessica asked, recognizing something in Dr. Mitchell's tone that suggested familiarity with similar situations. Let's just say that Eleanor contacted me several years ago about potential historical documents, but she wasn't ready to release them at that time. I've been waiting for this call. After arranging for Dr. Mitchell's visit that afternoon, Jessica spent the morning reading more of Robert's journal, while Emma explored their new property with the kind of thorough curiosity that a 10-year-old's applied to environments that offered unlimited discovery opportunities. The journal entries became increasingly detailed as Robert's tour progressed, documenting not just specific incidents, but patterns of behavior that suggested systematic efforts to conduct unauthorized operations while maintaining official deniability. Robert had apparently recognized that individual incidents might be dismissed as isolated mistakes, but comprehensive documentation of multiple violations would be much harder to explain away. By March 1968, just days before his death, Robert's entries reflected growing paranoia about his superiors' awareness of his documentation activities. Morrison has been asking questions about my correspondence with Eleanor. He knows I'm writing detailed letters home, but regulations allow personal communication. Still, I get the feeling he suspects I'm documenting more than personal observations. I've started keeping this journal separate from my official reports, and I'm going to mail it to Eleanor before we move to the next operation. If something happens to me, at least there will be a record of what we've really been doing here. Final entry, dated March 20th, 1968, just 2 days before. Robert's death contained instructions that explained Eleanor's 55 years of secrecy. Mailing this journal to Eleanor tomorrow along with copies of the documents I've been able to photograph. I've told her not to open it unless something happens to me, and to wait until enough time has passed that the people responsible for these operations are no longer in positions to retaliate against her. Eleanor is smart and strong enough to know when the time is right to bring this information forward. I love her more than I can express, and I trust her to make sure these records reach people who will understand their importance for American history. Jessica closed the journal, understanding now why Eleanor had waited so long to arrange for its disclosure. In 1968, the people responsible for the operations Robert documented would have been at the height of their military and political careers. With the power to destroy anyone who threatened to expose their activities, Eleanor had protected both herself and the integrity of Robert's documentation by waiting until those individuals were no longer in positions to suppress the evidence. Dr. Sarah Mitchell arrived at the farmhouse precisely at 2 p.m. Practical sedan that suggested academic rather than government employment. She appeared to be in her early 50s, with graying hair and the kind of intense focus that Jessica associated with people who spent their lives researching complex historical questions. Ms. Martinez, thank you for contacting me, Dr. Mitchell said as Jessica welcomed her into Eleanor's living room. Eleanor spoke about you several times over the years. She believed you had the integrity and courage necessary to handle sensitive historical material. She barely knew me, Jessica replied, still puzzled about Eleanor's confidence in her suitability for such responsibility. Eleanor was an excellent judge of character, and she had access to more information about your background than you might realize, Dr. Mitchell said, settling into one of Eleanor's comfortable chairs. She knew about your nursing career, your approach to handling confidential medical information, and your commitment to your daughter despite difficult circumstances. She saw qualities that convinced her you would prioritize truth over personal convenience. Jessica retrieved Robert's journal and the accompanying documents from the secure location where she had stored them overnight. Dr. Mitchell's expression grew increasingly serious as she examined the materials, occasionally making notes and asking specific questions about where and how Jessica had found them. Ms. Martinez, what you've discovered is extraordinarily significant, Dr. Mitchell said after spending nearly an hour reviewing Robert's documentation. This journal provides first-hand evidence of military operations that historians have suspected but never been able to prove. The level of detail and supporting documentation makes it virtually impossible to dismiss as fabrication or misunderstanding. What does that mean, practically speaking? Jessica asked. It means you're now the custodian of evidence that could fundamentally change historical understanding of American military conduct during the Vietnam War, Dr. Mitchell replied. It also means you're potentially in possession of information that certain people would prefer remain hidden, even after all these years. The warning sent a chill through Jessica. What kind of certain people? Government officials, military, historians, political figures who built careers on narratives that this documentation contradicts? Dr. Mitchell explained. Plus family members and associates of people who were involved in the operations Robert described. Some of those individuals are still alive, still influential, and still committed to protecting reputations and legacies that could be damaged by this information. Emma chose that moment to burst through the front door, her face flushed with excitement in her clothes bearing evidence of thorough exploration of the property's more adventurous areas. "Mom, there's a whole room in the barn that looks like someone was living there," she announced, before noticing Dr. Mitchell's presence. "Oh, sorry, I didn't know we had company. This is Dr. Mitchell from Penn State. She's helping us understand some of the historical documents we found in the attic." Dr. Mitchell smiled at Emma with the kind of warmth that suggested genuine appreciation for children's curiosity. "What kind of room did you find in the barn?" "It has a bed, a desk, and shelves with books and papers," Emma replied enthusiastically. "And there's a radio that looks really old, like from old movies." Jessica and Dr. Mitchell exchanged glances that conveyed mutual recognition of potential significance. Eleanor had apparently maintained more than just Robert's military records there. Might be additional documentation or equipment that could provide context for the journal's contents. "Emma, could you show us what you found?" Jessica asked. The barn was larger than Jessica had initially realized, with a main area that had once housed livestock and farming equipment, plus several smaller rooms that had apparently served various purposes over the decades. Emma led them to a room at the rear of the building that had clearly been converted into living quarters. Sometime in the distant past, the space contained a single bed with military-issue blankets, a desk covered with papers and maps, and shelves lined with books about military history, intelligence operations, and political science. The radio Emma had discovered was indeed vintage, apparently from the 1960s or early 1970s, with modifications that suggested it had been used for purposes beyond standard broadcasting. Eleanor created a research station, Dr. Mitchell observed. Examining the materials with growing excitement, she spent decades studying the context and implications of Robert's documentation. The papers on the desk revealed the extent of Eleanor's commitment to understanding her husband's final gift. She had apparently spent years researching the people, places, and operations mentioned in Robert's journal, creating detailed timelines and cross-references that connected his observations to broader patterns of military conduct during the Vietnam era. One folder contained newspaper clippings about congressional investigations into Vietnam War conduct, with handwritten notes in Eleanor's careful script connecting specific revelations to incidents documented in Robert's journal. Another folder held correspondence with other military families who had lost loved ones under circumstances that didn't match official explanations. Eleanor was building a case, Dr. Mitchell realized, studying the organizational system Eleanor had developed. She wasn't just preserving Robert's documentation, she was preparing a comprehensive argument for its historical significance and accuracy. Jessica felt overwhelmed by the scope of Eleanor's dedication. She spent 50 years researching this. More than researching, Dr. Mitchell corrected, holding up a folder marked verification. She was systematically confirming Robert's accounts by cross-referencing them with other sources, declassified documents, and testimony from other veterans. This isn't just one soldier's journal, it's a thoroughly documented historical argument. Emma had wandered to the radio and was examining its various dials and switches with the fascination that electronic devices held for children her age. "Dr. Mitchell, what was this radio used for?" Dr. Mitchell approached the device, noting modifications that suggested specialized capabilities. "This appears to be a shortwave radio with enhanced receiving capabilities. Eleanor might have used it to monitor military and government communications frequencies. Is that legal?" Jessica asked, concerned about the implications of Eleanor's research methods. Monitoring publicly accessible radio frequencies is generally legal, though the specific modifications to this equipment might have enhanced its capabilities beyond standard civilian use, Dr. Mitchell replied diplomatically. Eleanor was clearly committed to gathering as much information as possible to support Robert's documentation. They spent the next 2 hours cataloging Eleanor's research materials, discovering a comprehensive archive that included military records, government documents, veteran testimonies, and journalistic investigations that all supported the accuracy of Robert's journal entries. Eleanor had created what amounted to a complete case file for war crimes prosecutions, with evidence that met legal standards for verification and corroboration. Ms. Martinez, what Eleanor assembled here goes far. Beyond historical documentation, Dr. Mitchell said as they concluded their inventory, this is evidence that could potentially be used in legal proceedings, congressional investigations, or international war crimes tribunals. Even after all these years, Jessica asked. There's no statute of limitations on war crimes, Dr. Mitchell replied grimly. If the operations Robert documented involve violations of international land based on what I've seen, they clearly did, then this evidence could still have legal consequences for surviving participants. As the afternoon sun began to set over Millbrook Valley, Jessica found herself contemplating a future far more complex than the simple rural life she had envisioned when accepting Eleanor's inheritance. She was now the custodian of evidence that could expose war crimes, challenge official historical narratives, and potentially threaten powerful people who had spent decades protecting their reputations. What happens next? She asked Dr. Mitchell as they prepared to leave the barn. That depends on what you're prepared to do with this information, Dr. Mitchell replied. We have several options, each with different implications for your safety. And privacy? They returned to the farmhouse, where Dr. Mitchell outlined the choices Jessica faced while Emma prepared her evening insulin dose, with the competent efficiency that had become second nature despite her young age. Option 1. We turn everything over to the National Archives and let government historians decide how to handle the information, Dr. Mitchell explained. That's the safest approach for you personally, but it also gives government officials the opportunity to suppress or minimize the evidence. Option 2, Jessica asked. We work with investigative journalists to ensure the information receives public attention before government officials can control the narrative, Dr. Mitchell continued. That maximizes the historical impact, but also maximizes the potential for retaliation against you. And option 3, you present the evidence to an international war crimes tribunal or human rights organization that can pursue legal action independent of American government influence, Dr. Mitchell said. Offers the best chance for justice, but also creates the greatest personal risk for you and Emma. Jessica looked at her daughter, who was carefully monitoring her blood glucose levels. While apparently paying no attention to the adult conversation about war crimes and international tribunals, Emma's medical needs required stability, predictable healthcare access, to minimal stressor, of which would be compromised by any choice that brought public attention or government scrutiny to their situation. How much time do I have to decide? Jessica asked. Not as much as you might hope, Dr. Mitchell replied. Eleanor's death was reported in local newspapers, and her estate proceedings are public records. Anyone who is interested in suppressing Robert's documentation would be monitoring for signs that his materials had been discovered. You think people are already watching us? I think you should assume that possibility and take appropriate precautions, Dr. Mitchell said. They changed your daily routines, vary your travel patterns, and be alert for any signs of unusual interest in your activities. As Dr. Mitchell prepared to leave, she handed Jessica a business card with additional contact information. My office phone, my cell phone, and my home number. Call me immediately if anything unusual happens. Suspected visitors, unusual phone. Calls, vehicles you don't recognize in the area. Eleanor waited 55 years to release this information, but now that it's been discovered, events may move quickly. That evening, as Jessica helped Emma with her bedtime routine in their new home, she tried to process the magnitude of the responsibility Eleanor had placed on her shoulders. The farmhouse that had seemed like a refuge from their financial struggles had become the center of a historical controversy that could affect international relations and legal proceedings for years to come. Mom, Dr. Mitchell seemed really serious about those papers, Emma observed as Jessica checked her insulin pump settings for the night. They are serious, sweetheart. They contain information about historical events that could be important for helping people understand what really happened during a war. Like the history we learn in school? It's like history that maybe should be in school books but isn't yet, Jessica replied. Choosing her words carefully, Emma considered this while settling into her bed beneath windows that offered a view of stars, visible in ways they had never been in Pittsburgh. Are we going to help make sure people learn the real history? Jessica sat on the edge of Emma's bed, looking at her daughter's earnest face and recognizing the moral clarity that children often displayed when adults complicated simple questions of right and wrong. I don't know yet, Emma. It's a big decision. That could change our lives in ways we can't predict. But Great Aunt Eleanor saved those papers for us because she thought we would do the right thing, didn't she? Yes, I think that's exactly why she saved them for us. So then we should do the right thing, even if it's scary. Got you, Dorda, good night, marveling at the wisdom that seemed to come naturally to someone who had already faced significant challenges with courage and resilience. Emma's medical condition had taught her to approach difficulties with practical determination rather than fear, and her perspective on their current situation reflected that same straightforward courage. As Jessica sat on Eleanor's front porch that night, looking out over the valley where her great-aunt had spent 55 years protecting her, husband's final gift to history, she began to understand the weight of moral choices that extended beyond personal comfort or safety. Eleanor had sacrificed a normal life to preserve evidence of war crimes, waiting decades for the right person to ensure that Robert's documentation would reach people capable of pursuing justice. She had trusted Jessica with that responsibility based on character assessments that proved Eleanor understood both courage and integrity better than Jessica understood them herself. The journal that documented systematic violations of international law was now Jessica's responsibility, along with Eleanor's comprehensive research that provided the context necessary to understand its full significance. The decisions she made in the coming days would determine whether Robert Whitmore's sacrifice for historical truth would finally achieve its intended purpose, or whether powerful people would succeed in burying evidence that could change how Americans understood their country's military conduct. As the night deepened over Millbrook Valley, Jessica realized that her simple desire for a fresh start had evolved into a test of character that would define not just her own future, but potentially the future of historical truth about American involvement in Vietnam. The quiet farmhouse held secrets that could shake the foundations of official military history. And Jessica Martinez, a single mother who had moved to Pennsylvania, seeking only stability for her daughter, was about to discover whether she possessed the courage to ensure that those secrets finally came to light. Tomorrow would bring decisions that could protect or expose war crimes, honor or betray Eleanor's lifelong sacrifice, and determine whether ordinary people could still force powerful institutions to confront uncomfortable truths about their past actions. The story was entering its most dangerous phase, and Jessica had no idea how much her life was about to change. Jessica woke to the sound of unfamiliar vehicles on the gravel driveway, their engines running quietly in the pre-dawn darkness. Through Eleanor's bedroom window, she could see the silhouettes of at least 2 cars parked near the farmhouse, their occupants apparently waiting for a more reasonable hour to announce their presence. Her heart racing, Jessica quickly checked on Emma, who was still sleeping peacefully in her room across the hall. The digital clock on Eleanor's nightstand read 5:23 a.m., far too early for social visitors, but exactly the time that people with official business might arrive to ensure they found their targets at home. Moving carefully to avoid creaking floorboards, Jessica made her way to the kitchen window that offered the best view of the driveway. The vehicles were dark sedans with government license plates, confirming her worst fears about Dr. Mitchell's warnings regarding unwanted attention from federal agencies. As if responding to her observation, one of the car doors opened and a woman in a dark business suit emerged, followed by a man in similar attire. They moved with the practiced efficiency of people accustomed to conducting official business in uncomfortable circumstances, carrying briefcases and communication devices that suggested significant authority. Jessica's phone buzzed with a text. Message from Dr. Mitchell. Federal agents may contact you today. Say nothing without legal representation present. Call me immediately if they arrive. Too late for that advice. Jessica thought grimly as she watched the agents approach her front door with purposeful strides. She had perhaps 30 seconds to decide how to handle what was clearly going to be an official interrogation about Robert's journal and Eleanor's research materials. The knock on the door was firm, an announcement that government agents used when they wanted to appear reasonable. While making it clear that refusal to cooperate wasn't really an option, "Ms. Martinez," the woman called through the door, "could we speak with you briefly about some historical documents that may have been left to you by Eleanor Whitmore?" Jessica took a deep breath, remembering Dr. Mitchell's warnings about the importance of protecting both the evidence and her own legal rights. She opened the door but remained in the doorway, making it clear that the agents weren't being invited inside. "Of historical documents?" she asked, projecting the confusion of someone who genuinely didn't understand the significance of whatever materials they were investigating. Agent Wells was an attractive woman in her 40s with the kind of professional composure that came from years of conducting sensitive interviews. Her companion, Agent David Chen, appeared to be slightly older and carried himself with the bearing of someone who had spent time in military service. "We understand that Eleanor Whitmore may have preserved military records from her late husband's service in Vietnam," Agent Wells explained. "The Department of Defense is conducting a routine review of historical materials that might have been retained by family members rather than returned to official archives." Jessica recognized the careful phrasing that made their visit sound like bureaucratic housekeeping rather than an investigation into potential war crimes evidence. "I'm not sure what you mean. Eleanor left me her farmhouse and some personal belongings, but I haven't found any official military documents." "Ms. Martinez, we're not here to cause problems for you," Agent Chen said, voice carrying a tone of paternal reasonableness. "We simply need to ensure that any classified materials are handled through proper channels. If you've discovered anything that looks like official military documentation, we can help you transfer it to appropriate archives. That might never become available to historians or the public." "Haven't found anything like that," she repeated, already gathered about Jessica's activities. "We understand you had a visitor yesterday from Penn State University, Dr. Sarah Mitchell from the Military History Department. That suggests you may have found something that warrants academic review." Jessica felt cold certainty that her conversations were being monitored, but she maintained her facade of innocent confusion. "Dr. Mitchell was helping me understand some family papers Eleanor left behind. Nothing official or classified, just personal documents about my great-aunt's life." "Of course," Agent Wells replied with professional patience. "Would it be possible for us to take a look at those family papers, just to confirm that they don't contain any materials that should be handled through official channels?" The request was politely phrased, but carried the implicit threat of more aggressive investigation if Jessica refused to cooperate voluntarily. She was clearly being given the opportunity to hand over Robert's journal and Eleanor's research before federal agents obtained search warrants that would allow them to seize everything in the farmhouse. "I'm not comfortable with strangers going through my family's personal papers," Jessica replied, hoping to buy time while figuring out how to protect the evidence without appearing to obstruct a federal investigation. "About privacy," Agent Chen said, his tone becoming slightly more formal, "but we're obligated to ensure that classified materials don't remain in unauthorized possession, even if that possession was inherited innocently." To see her daughter standing on the staircase in her pajamas, above all other considerations, "Just some people asking questions about Great-Aunt Eleanor's papers," Jessica told Emma. "Why don't you get dressed and I'll make breakfast in a few minutes." Agent Wells watched Emma retreat upstairs with the kind of professional assessment that suggested she was evaluating how the presence of a child might affect their investigation strategy. "Ms. Martinez, we're trying to handle this matter quietly to avoid unnecessary complications for your family, but our responsibility to recover classified materials is something we take very seriously." The implicit threat was clear: cooperate voluntarily or face more aggressive federal investigation that would disrupt. Another text message, which she glanced at quickly: "Don't let them inside without a warrant. Buying time for legal support." "Dr. Mitchell, I need to consult with my attorney before discussing family documents with federal agents," Jessica said, using Dr. Mitchell's advice to establish legal boundaries around the conversation. Agent Chen's expression hardened slightly. "Ms. Martinez, do you have something to hide?" I don't have anything to hide, Jessica replied firmly. But I also don't have any experience with federal investigations. And I want to make sure I understand my rights and responsibilities before making decisions that might affect my daughter. Agent Wells nodded, as if this were a reasonable position, though her eyes suggested she was reassessing Jessica's level of sophistication about legal matters, of course. Later today, Jessica replied, having no idea whether Dr. Mitchell was actually arranging legal representation, simply trying to delay the federal investigation. We'll be back tomorrow morning, Agent Wells said. We hope to resolve this matter cooperatively, but we will recover any classified materials that may be in your possession. As the agents returned to their vehicles, Jessica watched them through the kitchen window while her mind raced through the implications of their visit. Federal investigators had somehow learned about Robert's journal within 24 hours of Dr. Mitchell's visit, suggesting either electronic surveillance of their communications or human sources. Within academic or government circles who had reported Dr. Mitchell's activities, Emma appeared in the kitchen, fully dressed and carrying her blood glucose testing kit. Mom, those people seemed like police. Are we in trouble? No, sweetheart, we're not in trouble, Jessica replied, helping Emma prepare her morning diabetes management routine. They're just asking questions about some old papers that belonged to Great Aunt Eleanor? Are the papers important? Jessica considered how to explain the situation without frightening Emma, while also preparing her for the possibility that their lives might become significantly more complicated. They might be important to historians who study what happened during the Vietnam War. The question is whether we're the right people to decide what happens to them. What did Great Aunt Eleanor want us to do? She wanted us to make sure that right people saw them and understood their importance for history. Emma tested her blood sugar with the competent efficiency that had become second nature, then looked up at Jessica with the kind of direct gaze that often preceded surprisingly insightful observations. Mom, if government people want the papers, but Great Aunt Eleanor wanted historians to see them, maybe the government people don't want historians to know what's in them. Jessica stared at her 8-year-old daughter, amazed by the logical clarity that cut through all the adult complications surrounding their situation. That's a very smart observation, Emma. So maybe we should make sure the historians get to see them first, before the government people take them away. Before Jessica could respond, her phone rang with a call from Dr. Mitchell. Jessica, are you and Emma safe? For now, federal agents just left, but they're coming back tomorrow with what sounds like demands rather than requests. I've arranged for legal representation from the Electronic Frontier Foundation. They specialize in cases involving government overreach and freedom of information issues, Dr. Mitchell said. Attorney named Marcus Webb will contact you within the hour. But more importantly, we need to get copies of Robert's documentation to secure locations before federal agents can seize the originals. How do we do that? I'm driving back to Millbrook Valley with a team of graduate students and professional archivists. We need to photograph every page of Robert's journal and catalog all of Eleanor's research materials before tomorrow morning. Jessica felt overwhelmed by the speed with which their quiet, rural life was being transformed into the center of a federal investigation. Is this legal? Is making copies of documents that the government claims are classified? That's exactly the kind of question Attorney Webb will help us navigate, Dr. Mitchell replied. But the fundamental issue is whether the government has the right to suppress historical evidence of war crimes simply by claiming classification authority. What about Emma? I can't put her at risk for this. Marcus Webb is also arranging for Emma to stay with a host family near Penn State if that becomes necessary. People who specialize in providing safe housing for families involved in sensitive legal cases. The prospect of separating from Emma, even temporarily, sent panic through Jessica. I won't send her away. We stay together, whatever happens. Understood. But we need contingency plans in case federal agents decide to escalate their pressure. Tactics. Dr. Mitchell's team arrived at the farmhouse within 3 hours, transforming Eleanor's quiet home into a bustling documentation center. Graduate students with professional photography equipment systematically captured images of every page of Robert's journal, while archivists cataloged Eleanor's research materials with a kind of methodical precision that would allow scholars To verify the historical significance of her work, attorney Marcus Webb arrived shortly after lunch. A tall man in his 50s, with graying hair and the kind of calm confidence that came from years of representing clients in high-stakes legal battles against government agencies. He reviewed the federal agent's visit with Jessica, taking detailed notes about their statements and implied threats. The Department of Defense doesn't have automatic authority to seize materials simply because they involve military history, Webb explained as they sat in Eleanor's living room, surrounded by the organized chaos of the documentation project. Classification authority has limits, especially when it comes to evidence of illegal activities. But they made it sound like we could be prosecuted for possessing classified materials, Jessica said. That's a common intimidation tactic, but it's not necessarily legally accurate, Webb replied. If you inherited these materials unknowingly and are cooperating with legitimate historical research, you have strong legal protections under whistleblower statutes and freedom of information precedents. Emma had been watching the documentation process with fascination, occasionally helping graduate students organize Eleanor's papers by date and subject. Her presence seemed to energize the academic team, explained their work, and answered her questions with the kind of patience that suggested they understood the importance of making their activities accessible to the family at the center of the controversy. Mr. Webb, Emma said during a break in his conversation with Jessica, why do government people not want historians to see Great-Uncle Robert's journal? Webb smiled at Emma's directness. That's an excellent question, Emma. Sometimes when people in government make mistakes or do things they shouldn't have done, they try to keep those things secret so they don't get in trouble or look bad. But if they did bad things, shouldn't people know about it so it doesn't happen again? That's exactly right. That's why we have laws that protect people who try to tell the truth about important things, even when powerful people don't want the truth to be told. Dr. Mitchell approached their conversation, carrying a folder of documents that her team had discovered in Eleanor's research files. Jessica, we've found something that changes the legal situation significantly. She opened the folder to reveal copies of congressional testimony from the 1970s, featuring statements by military officials who had explicitly denied knowledge of the operations that Robert documented in his journal. Eleanor had systematically collected evidence that government officials had lied under oath to Congress about activities that Robert had witnessed firsthand. This means we're not just dealing with classification issues, Attorney Webb realized. Studying the congressional testimony, we're dealing with evidence of perjury before Congress, which is a serious federal crime with no statute of limitations. What does that mean for us? Jessica asked. It means the government's interest in suppressing this information goes beyond protecting classified material, Webb explained. They're potentially trying to cover up evidence that federal officials committed crimes when they testified to Congress about military operations in Vietnam. Implications sent a chill through Jessica. If federal officials had committed perjury to hide the operations Robert documented, then her possession of contradictory evidence made her a threat to people with significant power and strong motivation to protect themselves. How dangerous does this make our situation? She asked. More dangerous than simple classification disputes, Webb admitted, but also more legally protected, because courts take a very dim view of government attempts to suppress evidence of official misconduct. As the afternoon progressed, the documentation team completed their work while Dr. Mitchell coordinated with other historians and journalists to ensure that copies of Robert's journal would be distributed to multiple secure locations. The strategy was designed to make it impossible for federal agents to suppress the evidence by seizing materials from a single source, or creating what's called insurance copies, Dr. Mitchell explained to Jessica as the team prepared to leave. Multiple news organizations, academic institutions, and human rights groups will have complete documentation of Robert's journal and Eleanor's research. If federal agents seize the originals from you, the historical evidence will still be available for public review. Emma had been quiet during the final preparations, apparently processing the day's events and their implications for her and Jessica's future. As the academic team loaded their equipment into vehicles, she approached Dr. Mitchell with a question that surprised the adults with its sophistication. Dr. Mitchell, if we give the government people Great-Uncle Robert's journal, Will they make sure nobody ever finds out about the bad things that happened in the war? They might try to, Emma. That's why we made copies and gave them to lots of works. Different people who study history and write for newspapers. So even if the government people take the journal away from us, other people will still be able to tell everyone about the true history. That's exactly right, Emma nodded with satisfaction. Then we did the right thing by helping you make copies. Evening, as Jessica and Emma sat on Eleanor's front porch watching the sun set over Millbrook Valley, Jessica reflected on how dramatically their lives had changed in just a few days. They had come to Pennsylvania seeking a quiet, fresh start, but instead had inherited responsibility for historical evidence that could expose war crimes and government. A cover-up dating back over 50 years. Mom, are you scared about the government? People coming back tomorrow? Emma asked as she monitored her evening blood glucose levels. A little bit, Jessica admitted, but I'm also proud of what we did today. Great-Aunt Eleanor protected those papers for 55 years, waiting for the right people to make sure the truth would come out. I think we helped her accomplish what she wanted, even if we get in trouble for it. Sometimes doing the right thing means accepting consequences that aren't fair, Jessica replied. But Mr. Webb thinks the law will protect us because we're helping. People learn the truth about important historical events. Dr. Mitchell made sure lots of other people have copies of the journal, so the truth will come out, even if the government people take our copies away. That's right. Emma was quiet for several minutes, apparently working through the moral complexities of their situation with the kind of thoughtful consideration that continued to amaze. Jessica, Mom, I think Great-Aunt Eleanor chose us because she knew we would be brave enough to do the right thing, even when it was scary. Jessica hugged her daughter, marveling at the wisdom and courage that seemed to come naturally to someone who had already faced significant medical challenges with remarkable resilience. I think you're absolutely right, sweetheart. I think great-uncle Robert would be proud that his journal's finally going to help people understand what really happened in Vietnam. As darkness fell over the farmhouse where Eleanor had spent 55 years protecting her husband's final gift to history, Jessica prepared for what would likely be the most difficult confrontation of her life. Federal agents would return in the morning with legal authority to seize Robert's journal and Eleanor's research materials. But the historical truth those documents contained was now beyond their ability to suppress. The copies that Dr. Mitchell's team had created were already being reviewed by historians, journalists, and human rights organizations who would ensure that Robert Whitmore's documentation of war crimes would finally receive the attention he had died trying to secure. Jessica Martinez, a single mother who had inherited far more than a farmhouse, had successfully protected the historical evidence that Eleanor had entrusted to her care. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as federal agents attempted to control the narrative surrounding Robert's revelations. But the truth about American military conduct in Vietnam was now in the hands of people who would ensure it reached the public. The story was entering its most dangerous phase. But Jessica had already accomplished what Eleanor had spent a lifetime preparing for, ensuring that her husband's sacrifice for historical truth would finally achieve its intended purpose. Whatever happened next, Robert Whitmore's journal would change how Americans understood their country's involvement in the Vietnam War, and justice might finally be served for the war crimes he had documented over 50 years ago. The second visit from federal agents came exactly as promised, but with a significantly larger team and a very different approach. Jessica watched from Eleanor's kitchen window as 4 black SUVs pulled into her driveway at precisely 8 a.m. Disgorging agents carrying equipment that looked more appropriate for a major criminal investigation than a routine document recovery. Agent Wells led the group, but this time she was accompanied by agents from multiple agencies' Department of Defense, FBI, and what appeared to be personnel from intelligence services whose specific affiliations weren't immediately clear. They moved with the coordinated efficiency of people executing a carefully planned operation. Attorney Marcus Webb had arrived an hour earlier, having spent the night at a hotel in nearby Harrisburg, to ensure he would be present for whatever confrontation the morning might bring. His experience with federal overreach cases had taught him to expect escalation when government agencies encountered unexpected resistance to their initial demands. Remember, Webb told Jessica as they watched the agents organize their approach, They're going to try to intimidate you with displays of authority and implied threats about national security. But they still need legal justification for everything they do, and we're going to hold them to those requirements. Emma sat at the kitchen table, apparently focused on her morning diabetes management routine, but clearly listening to every word of the adult conversation. Her overnight glucose readings had been elevated, reflecting the stress of their situation. But she was handling the crisis with the same practical competence she applied to managing her medical condition. The knock on the door was more assertive than the previous day's polite announcement, carrying the authority of people who no longer considered cooperation optional. Miss Martinez, this is Agent Wells," came the familiar voice. "We have a federal search warrant for these premises. Please open the door." Webb nodded to Jessica, who opened the door to find Agent Wells holding official documentation, while a dozen federal agents waited behind her with equipment cases and what appeared to be electronic surveillance. "Agent Wells, I'm Marcus Webb, representing Ms. Martinez," the attorney announced immediately. "We'll need to review that warrant before allowing access to the property." Agent Wells handed Webb the warrant while Agent Chen addressed Jessica directly. "Ms. Martinez, this warrant authorizes us to search for and seize any documents, materials, or electronic devices that may contain classified information related to military operations during the Vietnam War." Webb studied the warrant with the careful attention of someone who understood how federal agencies could use broad language to justify searches that exceeded their actual legal authority. "This warrant is extremely broad," he observed. "It appears to authorize seizure of any materials that might theoretically contain classified information, regardless of how you acquired them or your intent in possessing them." "Mr. Webb, we're not here to debate legal technicalities," Agent Chen replied with the kind of official patience that barely concealed irritation. "We're here to recover materials that pose potential risks to national security if they remain in unauthorized possession." "What specific materials are you looking for?" Webb asked. "The warrant language is vague enough to justify seizing every document and electronic device on this property." Agent Wells consulted her tablet before responding. "We're specifically seeking military records, journals, correspondence, and research materials related to Lieutenant Robert Whitmore's service in Vietnam, plus any documents or files created by Eleanor Whitmore in connection with those materials." The specificity of their knowledge confirmed Jessica's suspicions about surveillance of her activities and communications. Federal agencies clearly knew exactly what she had found and had conducted sufficient investigation to justify a warrant that would allow them to seize everything related to Robert's documentation and Eleanor's research. "Before we proceed," Webb said, "I need to inform you that my client has been cooperating with legitimate historical research into these materials. Some of the documents you're seeking may now be in the possession of academic institutions for scholarly review." Agent Wells' expression hardened. "Mr. Webb, if your client has transferred classified materials to unauthorized parties, that constitutes a serious federal crime. We'll need a complete accounting of any such transfers before we conclude our investigation." Jessica felt the weight. A federal authority focusing on her activities, but she also remembered Dr. Mitchell's assurance that distributing copies of the documents to historians and journalists provided legal protection under whistleblower statutes and freedom of information precedents. "My client inherited these materials unknowingly and has been seeking appropriate guidance about their historical significance," Webb replied carefully. "Any cooperation with academic researchers has been conducted in good faith to ensure proper handling of potentially important historical evidence. That's a matter for federal prosecutors to determine," Agent Chen said, signaling to his team to begin their search. "Ms. Martinez, we'll need you and your daughter to remain in the kitchen area while we conduct our search." Emma looked up from her blood glucose monitor, studying the federal agents with the kind of direct curiosity that made adults uncomfortable. "Are you here to take Great Uncle Robert's journal?" Agent Wells approached Emma with the careful manner that law enforcement officers used when dealing with children during official operations. "We're here to collect some historical documents, sweetheart. It won't take very long." "My mom already made sure historians could study the journal," Emma replied matter-of-factly. "So even if you take it away, people will still be able to learn about the true history of the Vietnam War. The statement clearly surprised Agent Wells, who exchanged glances with Agent Chen that suggested they hadn't expected an 8-year-old to understand the implications of their document recovery operation. "Emma," Jessica said gently, "why don't you work on your school reading while the agents do their job?" But Emma wasn't finished with her observations. "Agent Wells, why doesn't the government want people to know about what Great-Uncle Robert wrote in his journal?" Agent Wells struggled to find an appropriate response for a child's direct question about government efforts to suppress historical evidence. Sometimes military records contain information that could be harmful if it became public too quickly, before experts can review it properly. But the historians are experts, Emma pointed out with 8-year-old logic. And Dr. Mitchell said, "Some of the people who did bad things during the war are still alive and don't want to get in trouble for what they did." The observation hit uncomfortably close to the actual motivations behind the federal investigation. Agent Wells clearly didn't know how to respond to a child who had cut through official justifications to identify the real issues at stake. "That's a very complicated situation, Emma," she said finally. "There are many factors involved that are difficult to explain." Emma nodded politely, but returned to her reading with the kind of satisfied expression that suggested she understood perfectly well why the agents had difficulty explaining their actual mission. The search proceeded with methodical thoroughness as federal agents photographed and cataloged every document in Eleanor's house. They seized Robert's original journal, Eleanor's research files, the modified radio equipment from the barn, and several boxes of correspondence and historical materials that Eleanor had accumulated over 50 years of investigation. But Jessica could see frustration growing among the agents as they realized that the most important materials, the detailed photographic documentation of Robert's journal and Eleanor's comprehensive research, were no longer on the property. Dr. Mitchell's team had succeeded in creating and distributing complete copies before the federal search warrant could be executed. Ms. Martinez, Agent Wells said as the search neared completion, "We need you to provide a complete list of everyone who has had access to these materials and every organization that may have received copies of classified documents." Webb intervened before Jessica could respond. "Agent Wells, my client will not be providing information that could be used to intimidate or retaliate against academic researchers, journalists, or human rights organizations who are conducting legitimate review of historical materials." "Mr. Webb, obstruction of a federal investigation is a serious crime," Agent Chen warned. "Your client's cooperation could significantly affect how federal prosecutors view her role in the unauthorized distribution of classified materials." "My client's role was inheriting historical documents and seeking appropriate expert guidance about their significance," Webb replied firmly. "She has committed no crimes, and she will not be intimidated into revealing information that could compromise the safety of historians and journalists who are performing important public service." Emma looked up from her book, apparently following the legal confrontation with more understanding than the adults expected. "Mr. Webb, are the government people trying to scare my mom into telling them who has copies of Great-Uncle Robert's journal?" "That's exactly what they're trying to do, Emma," Webb replied with the kind of direct honesty that children appreciated. "But you're not going to let them scare her, right?" "No, I'm not going to let them scare her." Agent Wells clearly found the child's commentary on their investigation both surprising and problematic. But she couldn't very well argue with an 8-year-old about federal law enforcement tactics in front of her. "Attorney." As the agents concluded their search, Jessica realized that Eleanor's farmhouse felt fundamentally different now that federal investigators had photographed and cataloged every personal belonging, document, and piece of correspondence that Eleanor had preserved over decades of solitary life. The invasion of privacy felt like a violation of Eleanor's memory. Even though Jessica understood that protecting Robert's historical documentation required accepting such consequences, "Ms. Martinez," Agent Wells said, as her team prepared to leave with boxes of seized materials, "this investigation is ongoing. Don't leave the state without notifying federal authorities. And don't destroy any materials related to the documents we've recovered today." "My client will comply with all legal requirements," Webb replied on Jessica's behalf. But she also reserves her rights under whistleblower protection statutes and freedom of information precedents. After the federal agents departed, Jessica, Emma, and attorney Webb sat in Eleanor's kitchen, processing the morning's events and their implications for the next phase of their legal situation. "How much trouble are we in?" Jessica asked Webb directly. "Less than they want you to think. But more than I'd prefer," Webb replied honestly. "The government's primary concern isn't really national security. It's preventing embarrassment and legal liability for officials who may still be alive and vulnerable to prosecution for war crimes or perjury. What happens next? Federal prosecutors will review the materials they seized and decide whether to pursue charges against you for unauthorized possession of classified documents," Webb explained. "But they'll also have to weigh that decision against the public relations disaster of prosecuting a single mother who inherited historical evidence of government war crimes." Emma had been listening carefully to the legal discussion while monitoring her blood glucose levels. "Mr. Webb, what if the government people decide they want to put my mom in jail?" Webb smiled at Emma's direct approach to complex legal questions. "Emma, I'm going to do everything possible to make sure that doesn't happen. And Dr. Mitchell and her historian friends are going to make sure that Great-Uncle Robert's journal becomes public knowledge before the government can suppress it. So we already won, even if the government people are mad at us." It's a very smart way to think. "About it, Emma? The most important goal was making sure the historical truth would come out, and we accomplished that." Jessica felt a surge of pride in her daughter's ability to understand the moral dimensions of their situation while maintaining her characteristic optimism and practical approach to challenges. That afternoon brought news that confirmed Emma's assessment about their success. Dr. Mitchell called to report that major news. Organizations were preparing comprehensive reports about Robert's journal, based on the documentation that her team had distributed to multiple sources. The Washington Post, New York Times, and Associated Press all have complete copies of Robert's documentation, plus Eleanor's corroborating research, Dr. Mitchell reported. They're coordinating publication to ensure maximum impact and to prevent any single organization from being pressured to suppress the story. "When will the stories be published?" Jessica asked. "Tomorrow morning. All 3 organizations will release comprehensive reports simultaneously. Plus, several academic institutions will publish scholarly analysis of the historical significance." "And what does that mean for Jessica's legal situation?" Webb asked, having listened to the conversation on speakerphone. "It means federal prosecutors will have to decide whether to pursue charges against Jessica, while the entire country is reading about the war crimes that government officials have been trying to cover up for 50 years, Dr. Mitchell replied. "That's not usually the kind of environment where prosecutors want to be seen attacking whistleblowers." Emma looked up from her afternoon homework with a question that demonstrated her continued engagement with the adult complexity surrounding their situation. "Dr. Mitchell, will people be mad at the government when they find out about the bad things that happened in Vietnam?" "Some people will be very upset, Emma, but most people will be proud that Americans like your great-uncle Robert tried to do the right thing by documenting the truth, and that people like your mom made sure that truth finally came to light." "And what about the people who did the bad things and tried to cover them up?" Questions about their actions both during the war and in the years since, when they tried to hide what really happened. That evening, as Jessica and Emma sat on Eleanor's front porch, watching the sun set over Millbrook Valley, Jessica reflected on how completely their lives had been transformed by Eleanor's inheritance. They had come to Pennsylvania seeking only financial stability and a fresh start, but instead had become central figures in a historical controversy that would affect American understanding of the Vietnam War for generations to come. "Mom, do you think Great-Aunt Eleanor knew this would happen when she left us the farmhouse?" Emma asked as she prepared her evening insulin dose. "I think she hoped we would be brave enough to do the right thing with Great-Uncle Robert's journal, even if it meant getting into trouble with the government," Jessica replied. "But I don't think she could have predicted exactly how everything would work out. Are you glad we did the right thing, even though it's been scary and complicated?" Jessica considered the question while watching the peaceful valley where Eleanor had spent 55 years protecting her husband's final gift to history. Despite the federal investigation, the legal uncertainty, and the complete disruption of their plans for a quiet rural life, she felt a profound sense of satisfaction about their role in ensuring that Robert's documentation would finally reach the public. "Yes, sweetheart, I'm very glad we did the right thing. Great-Uncle Robert died trying to make sure people would know the truth about what happened in Vietnam. Great-Aunt Eleanor spent her whole life protecting that truth. We made sure his sacrifice wasn't wasted, even if we get in trouble for it." "Even if we get in trouble for it," Jessica confirmed. "Some things are more important than avoiding trouble." Emma nodded with the kind of matter-of-fact acceptance that had characterized her approach to managing diabetes, federal investigations, and all the other challenges that had shaped her young life. "Mom, I think tomorrow is going to be a very interesting day." Jessica smiled at her daughter's understated prediction. Tomorrow would bring the publication of Robert's journal in major news organizations across the country, congressional demands for investigations into the war crimes he had documented, and probably renewed federal attention too. Jessica's role in bringing the evidence to light, but it would also bring vindication for Robert Whitmore's sacrifice, justice for the victims of the war crimes he had documented, and historical truth that had been suppressed for over 50 years. As darkness fell over the farmhouse where Eleanor had waited so patiently for the right person to ensure that her husband's final gift would reach the world, Jessica prepared for whatever consequences might follow from their decision to prioritize historical truth over personal safety. The journal that had waited in Eleanor's attic for over 50 years would tomorrow become front-page news across America, and Robert Whitmore's documentation of war crimes would finally achieve the public attention he had died trying to secure. Jessica Martinez, a single mother who had inherited far more than a farmhouse, had successfully completed the mission that Eleanor had spent a lifetime preparing. Whatever happened next, she and Emma had ensured that the truth about American military conduct in Vietnam would no longer remain hidden in government archives. The story was approaching its climax, and Jessica was ready to face whatever consequences came from doing the right thing, supported by her daughter's moral clarity and sustained by their shared commitment to honoring the trust that Eleanor had placed in their hands. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight they could rest knowing they had fulfilled their responsibility to history, to Robert's memory, and to Eleanor's lifelong sacrifice for truth and justice. The morning that would change American understanding of the Vietnam War began. Before dawn, with Jessica's phone ringing incessantly, she had expected media attention once the news stories broke. But the volume of calls from reporters, historians, and government officials exceeded anything Attorney Webb had prepared her for. "Mom," Emma called from her bedroom window, "there are news trucks in our driveway." Jessica looked outside to see a convoy of vehicles with satellite dishes and camera equipment, their crews apparently having arrived in the pre-dawn darkness to ensure they would be positioned for live coverage when the coordinated publication of Robert's journal became national news. The Washington Post had published its story at 6 o'clock, Eastern Time, with the headline "Secret Vietnam War Journal Reveals Systematic War Crimes and Government Cover-Up." The New York Times followed minutes later with classified documents, show pattern of unauthorized military operations and congressional perjury. The Associated Press distributed a comprehensive report to newspapers across the country, ensuring that Robert Whitmore's documentation would reach every major media market simultaneously. Dr. Mitchell called as Jessica was helping Emma prepared her morning diabetes management routine, while trying to process the magnitude of the media response their actions had triggered. "Jessica, the reaction is beyond anything we anticipated," Dr. Mitchell reported, her voice carrying excitement and concern in equal measure. "Congressional leaders are demanding immediate hearings. The Pentagon has issued a statement calling for investigation into the authenticity of the documents, and at least 6 foreign governments have announced they're reviewing the evidence for potential war crimes prosecutions." "What does that mean for us?" Jessica asked, watching Emma test her blood glucose with the same calm competence she had maintained throughout their extraordinary circumstances. "It means you've become the most important witness in what might be the biggest military scandal in American history," Dr. Mitchell replied. but it also means you have more protection than ever. Because prosecuting you now would look like retaliation for exposing government wrongdoing. Attorney Webb arrived within the hour, navigating through the crowd of reporters who shouted questions about Jessica's role in obtaining and releasing the classified documents. His expression carried the satisfaction of someone whose legal strategy had proved successful under the most challenging circumstances. Jessica, federal prosecutors who threatened you yesterday are now dealing with congressional demands for investigation into the war crimes you helped expose, Webb reported as they gathered in Eleanor's kitchen. It's going to be very difficult for them to justify pursuing charges against a whistleblower while the entire country is reading about the government misconduct, she revealed. Emma looked up from her breakfast, apparently following the legal and political implications with her characteristic directness. Mr. Webb, does this mean the government people can't put my mom in jail anymore? It means it would be politically very difficult for them to try, Webb replied carefully. Public opinion is strongly supporting your mom's decision to ensure these historical documents became available to researchers and the public. And what about the people who did the bad things that great-uncle Robert wrote about in his journal? Some of those people are going to face very serious questions about their actions, both during the war and in the years since, when they tried to cover up what really happened. As the morning progressed, the media attention intensified beyond anything Jessica had imagined possible. News anchors provided live coverage from Eleanor's driveway. Congressional representatives issued statements calling for immediate investigations, and international human rights organizations announced they were reviewing Robert's documentation for evidence that could support war crimes prosecutions. The phone rang constantly with interview requests from major television networks, documentary filmmakers, and journalists from around the world who wanted to speak with the woman whose inheritance had exposed one of the most. Ms. Martinez called a reporter from CNN as Jessica stepped onto Eleanor's front porch. Can you tell us how you discovered Lieutenant Whitmore's journal and what motivated you to make it public, despite government pressure to keep it classified? Looked out at the assembled media representatives, many of whom had traveled hundreds of miles to cover a story that had emerged from the quiet farmhouse where Eleanor had waited 55 years for the right moment to reveal her husband's final gift to history. I inherited these documents from my great-aunt Eleanor Whitmore, who spent her entire adult life protecting her husband's records because she believed the American people deserved to know the truth about what happened during the Vietnam War, Jessica said, speaking clearly enough for the multiple microphones and cameras to capture her words. Were you aware that the documents contained classified information when you shared them with historians? Asked a reporter from the Washington Post. I was aware that they contained information the government preferred to keep secret, Jessica replied, but I was also aware that they documented serious crimes that had been covered up for over 50 years. Sometimes protecting classified information means protecting evidence of wrongdoing rather than protecting national security. What? Do you say to critics who argue that you endangered national security by releasing military secrets? Asked a Fox News correspondent. Emma appeared beside Jessica on the porch, apparently deciding that the media attention required her participation despite her young age. Great-uncle Robert died trying to make sure people knew the truth about bad things that happened during the war, she said with the clear voice that had characterized all her observations throughout their ordeal. My mom made sure his sacrifice wasn't wasted by letting historians study what he wrote. The sight of an 8-year-old articulating the moral dimensions of their situation with such clarity clearly affected the assembled reporters, many of whom shifted their questioning to focus on the human story behind the historical revelations. Emma, how do you feel about the attention your family is receiving? Asked a local television reporter. Great-aunt Eleanor kept great-uncle Robert's journal safe for 55 years because she knew someday the right people would make sure everyone learned about the true history. Dr. Mitchell arrived during the impromptu press conference, accompanied by several colleagues from Penn State and other universities, who had spent the night reviewing the complete documentation and preparing scholarly analysis of its historical significance. The Whitmore documents represent the most comprehensive first-hand account of unauthorized military operations during the Vietnam War ever made available to historians, Dr. Mitchell announced to the assembled media. Lieutenant Whitmore documented systematic violations of international law, unauthorized military actions, and subsequent cover-ups that extended to perjury before Congress. Dr. Mitchell called a reporter from NPR, "What makes you confident that these documents are authentic rather than fabricated? The level of detail, the accuracy of dates and locations, the correlation with declassified materials that have become available through other sources, and the supporting research that Eleanor Whitmore conducted over 50 years all confirm authenticity," Dr. Mitchell replied. Plus, fabricating this level of documentation would require knowledge and access to classified information that no civilian could have possessed. As the press conference continued, Jessica noticed federal agents observing from vehicles positioned at the edge of her property. Agent Wells and Agent Chen were apparently monitoring the media coverage, while presumably coordinating with federal prosecutors about how to respond to the public revelation of information they had attempted to suppress. Just days earlier, Attorney Webb noticed her attention to the federal surveillance. "They're in a very difficult position now," he observed quietly. "Yesterday, they were threatening to prosecute you for possessing classified documents. Today, they have to explain to Congress and the American people why they tried to suppress evidence of war crimes and government cover-ups." The afternoon brought a development that exceeded even Webb's optimistic predictions about the political protection that media attention would provide. Senator Patricia Richardson, chair of the Senate Armed Services Committee, announced that Congress would hold immediate hearings into the military operations documented in Robert's journal, and that Jessica would be invited to testify as a protected witness under federal whistleblower statutes. Ms. Martinez, Senator Richardson's office called to inform them. "The senator believes your decision to preserve and release these historical documents represents exactly the kind of civic courage that American democracy depends on. She wants to ensure you receive full legal protection while Congress investigates the serious allegations contained in Lieutenant Whitmore's documentation." Webb smiled as he relayed the senator's message. "Congressional protection under whistleblower statutes makes it virtually impossible for federal prosecutors to pursue charges against you. Politicians don't want to be seen attacking witnesses who expose government wrongdoing." That evening, as the media attention began to subside and reporters returned to file their stories for the next day's coverage, Jessica and Emma sat in Eleanor's living room, processing the magnitude of what they had accomplished and experienced over the past week. The television news coverage provided a comprehensive overview of the national and international reaction to Robert's documentation. Congressional leaders from both parties had demanded immediate investigations. The Department of Defense had announced a formal review of the allegations. International human rights organizations had begun preliminary assessments for potential war crimes prosecutions. Military historians were calling it the most significant release of Vietnam War documentation since the Pentagon Papers. "Mom," Emma said as they watched coverage of congressional statements about the need for accountability and transparency, "do you think Great-Uncle Robert knew that his journal would be this important? I think he hoped it would help people understand what really happened during the war," Jessica replied. "But I don't think he could have imagined that it would take 55 years and Great-Aunt Eleanor's determination for his documentation to finally reach the public. And do you think Great-Aunt Eleanor knew we would be brave enough to do the right thing when the government people tried to scare us?" Jessica considered the question while looking around Eleanor's living room, which still showed signs of the federal search but maintained the careful organization and quiet dignity that had characterized Eleanor's approach to preserving her husband's legacy. "I think she recognized something in us that we didn't even recognize in ourselves," Jessica said finally. "She saw that we would choose doing the right thing over protecting ourselves, even when that choice involved risks we couldn't fully understand. Like how I have to be brave about managing my diabetes, even when it's scary or hard. Exactly like that. We've learned that facing difficult things, honestly, is usually better than pretending they don't exist or hoping someone else will deal with them." Emma nodded with the kind of satisfaction that came from understanding how her personal experiences connected to larger questions about courage and responsibility. The next few weeks brought a whirlwind of activity that transformed Jessica and Emma's quiet rural life into the center of a national conversation about government accountability. military conduct, and the importance of preserving historical truth, even when it challenged official narratives. Jessica testified before 3 congressional committees, providing detailed accounts of how she had discovered Robert's journal, why she had chosen to share it with historians, and how federal agents had attempted to suppress the evidence before it could reach the public. Her testimony, delivered with the same practical honesty that had characterized her approach to their entire ordeal, was widely praised as an example of civic courage and moral clarity. Emma accompanied Jessica to Washington for the congressional hearings, where her presence reminded lawmakers that the decisions they made about accountability and transparency would affect future generations, who deserved to inherit accurate historical records rather than sanitized versions that protected government officials from embarrassment. The congressional investigations revealed even more extensive misconduct than Robert's journal had documented. Other military families came forward with evidence that their loved ones had also attempted to document unauthorized operations and war crimes, only to have their reports suppressed or their careers destroyed by superiors who prioritized cover-ups. Over accountability. Several retired military officials who had lied to Congress during previous investigations into Vietnam war conduct were referred to federal prosecutors for perjury charges. The Department of Defense implemented new policies for preserving and declassifying historical records to prevent future cover-ups. International tribunals began reviewing the evidence for potential war crimes prosecutions. Though the passage of time made criminal charges unlikely, most importantly, for Jessica and Emma, the national attention brought recognition and support that transformed their financial situation and their sense of security. Book publishers offered substantial advances for Jessica to write about their experience. Documentary filmmakers provided funding for Emma's education in exchange for participation in historical documentaries. The Veterans Administration established a scholarship fund in Robert Whitmore's name, with Emma as the first recipient. 6 months after discovering Robert's journal in Eleanor's attic, Jessica stood before a joint session of Congress to receive the John F. Kennedy Profile and Courage Award for her decision to prioritize historical truth over personal safety. Emma accompanied her to the ceremony, wearing a dress that belonged to Eleanor and carrying a photograph of Robert in his military uniform. The courage to do what is right, even when it is difficult, dangerous, or unpopular, represents the best of American civic values, the speaker said during the award presentation. Jessica Martinez chose to honor her great-aunt's trust and her great-uncle's sacrifice by ensuring that the truth about American military conduct would not remain hidden in government archives. Her decision reminds us that democracy depends on citizens who are willing to hold their government accountable, regardless of the personal cost. As Jessica accepted the award, she thought about Eleanor's 55 years of patient determination, Robert's decision to document the truth even when it cost him his life, and Emma's moral clarity that had helped guide them through their most difficult decisions. The farmhouse in Millbrook Valley had been restored and expanded with the proceeds from book deals and documentary rights, but Jessica and Emma had chosen to remain in the community that had become their home. The property now included a research center dedicated to preserving military records and supporting families who inherited historical documents that governments preferred to keep secret. Dr. Mitchell had established the Whitmore Institute for Military History Transparency at Penn State. Using donations from individuals who believed, Jessica's story demonstrated the importance of protecting whistleblowers who exposed government misconduct. The institute provided legal support, historical research capabilities, and secure document preservation for families in situations similar to what Jessica and Emma had experienced. Eleanor's barn had been converted into a museum that displayed Robert's journal alongside hundreds of other documents that families had contributed after learning about the Whitmore case. The museum attracted visitors from around the world who wanted to understand how ordinary people could influence historical understanding by choosing courage over convenience. "Mom," Emma said one evening, as they sat on Eleanor's front porch, watching the sun set over the valley where they had built their new life. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we had given Great-Uncle Robert's journal to the government people when they first asked for it? I think the truth would have disappeared into government archives, and nobody would ever have learned about the things Robert documented," Jessica replied. The people who committed war crimes would have kept their secrets, and families who lost loved ones would never have known what really happened. So Great Aunt Eleanor was right to wait until she found people who would do the right thing, even when it was scary. She was absolutely right, and she was right to trust us to make the difficult choices that would honor Robert's sacrifice and serve the cause of historical truth. Emma smiled with a kind of quiet satisfaction that had characterized her approach to managing her diabetes, navigating federal investigations, and all the other challenges that had shaped her young life. I'm glad we were brave enough to do what Great Aunt Eleanor hoped we would do. So am I, sweetheart. So am I. As darkness fell over the farmhouse where Eleanor had waited so patiently for the right people to ensure that her husband's final gift would reach the world, Jessica reflected on how completely their lives had been transformed by choosing to honor the trust that had been placed in them. They had come to Pennsylvania seeking only financial stability and a fresh start. Instead, they had inherited responsibility for historical evidence that changed American understanding of the Vietnam War, exposed government cover-ups that had lasted for decades, and demonstrated that ordinary people could hold powerful institutions accountable when they possessed the courage to prioritize truth over personal safety. Robert Whitmore's journal, hidden in Eleanor's attic for over 50 years, had finally achieved its intended purpose of ensuring that the American people knew the truth about military operations that had been systematically concealed from public knowledge. Eleanor's lifelong sacrifice for that truth had been vindicated by Jessica and Emma's decision to protect the evidence and share it with historians who could ensure its preservation and accessibility. The congressional investigations had led to policy changes that would prevent future cover-ups. The international attention had strengthened protections for military personnel who reported misconduct. The legal precedents had enhanced whistleblower protections for civilians who inherited or discovered evidence of government wrongdoing. Most importantly, Jessica and Emma had learned that they possessed reserves of courage and moral clarity that enabled them to make difficult choices when the stakes extended far beyond their personal circumstances. Eleanor's faith in their character had proved justified, and Robert's sacrifice for historical truth had finally achieved its intended impact. The quiet farmhouse in Millbrook Valley continued to serve as their home, but it now also stood as a symbol of the possibility that individual courage could overcome institutional efforts to suppress uncomfortable truths. Visitors came from around the world to understand how a single mother and her 8-year-old daughter had changed the course of American military history by choosing to do the right thing when powerful people expected them to remain silent. The inheritance that had seemed like a simple opportunity for a fresh start had evolved into a legacy that would influence American democracy, military accountability, and historical preservation for generations to come. Jessica Martinez, who had sought only a place where she and Emma could build a meaningful life, had instead become a guardian of historical truth whose courage had ensured that Robert Whitmore's final gift to his country would never be forgotten. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us. Remember that sometimes the smallest inheritance is a farmhouse, a journal, a trust placed in us by those who came before, can lead to the most profound discoveries about our own capacity for heroism. Until next time, remember that history belongs to all of us, and that protecting the truth about our past is one of the most important gifts we can give to future generations. The courage to do what's right, even when it's dangerous, is what separates those who merely exist from those who truly make a difference in the world.